My name is Meredith, 33 years old, and a week after giving birth, I came home from the hospital to find my house sold. My husband had drained our accounts and handed me a single $100 bill to start a new life on the sidewalk. I sold my wedding ring just to survive the night. At the train station, I used my last dollar to buy a stranded old man a ticket. I had no idea that 2 weeks later, a black limousine would pull up outside my parents' house, and the man stepping out of it would hand me the power to destroy the people who broke me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The late November wind cut right through my thin hospital cardigan as I stood on the front porch of the suburban home I had spent 3 years turning into a sanctuary. I held my sleeping newborn daughter tightly against my chest, trying to shield her from the biting cold. My body was still aching and weak from a difficult delivery and a prolonged hospital stay. All I wanted was to step inside my own foyer sink into the familiar comfort of our living room sofa, and finally introduce my baby to the nursery I had spent months painting and decorating. I fumbled with my keychain, my fingers stiff and numb, and slid my house key into the brass deadbolt. It did not turn. I jiggled the handle, pulled the key out, and tried again. It refused to catch. The metallic scraping sound felt unnaturally loud in the quiet neighborhood. Panic, raw and instinctive, began to bubble in my throat. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, assuming Greg had perhaps locked the interior security latch by mistake. I knocked again, louder this time, shifting my baby's weight to my other hip. When the door finally swung open, the relief I felt lasted for exactly one fraction of a second. Standing in my foyer was not my husband. It was a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair holding a mug of coffee. What made my breath catch in my lungs was what she was wearing. It was my custom white silk bathrobe, the one I had packed away in my closet specifically to wear during my postpartum recovery. I stared at her, completely disoriented, my mind struggling to process the visual information in front of me. I asked what she was doing in my house. I asked her to take off my robe. She did not look embarrassed or surprised. Instead, she offered a slow, pitying smile and took a sip from her mug. It was my favorite mug. Greg stepped into the hallway from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He was not dressed in his usual weekend sweatpants. He wore a sharp, tailored suit, looking immaculate and completely composed. He stopped beside the blonde woman, placing a casual, possessive hand on the small of her back. He looked at me, taking in my pale face, my exhausted posture, and the tiny bundle swaddled in blankets against my chest. There was no warmth in his eyes, no concern for his week-old child, and absolutely no remorse. He told me I was trespassing. The words were delivered with a casual flatness that felt like a physical blow. He stated plainly that I no longer lived there. I stood frozen on the welcome mat, my brain misfiring. I reminded him that my name was on the deed. I told him we bought this house together, that we shared a mortgage, that I had paid half the down payment with my earnings as a financial auditor. I told him to stop playing a sick joke and let me inside so I could feed our daughter. Greg stepped out onto the porch, pulling the front door partially closed behind him so the cold air would not bother the woman in my bathrobe. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a thick, leather-bound legal folder. He held it up, flipping it open to a page marked with a red sticky note. He informed me that the house had been sold. He explained with the clinical precision of a corporate presentation that he had executed a rapid cash sale to a private buyer 3 days ago while I was recovering in the maternity ward. I shook my head, my voice rising in panic. I told him that was legally impossible without my signature. I told him I had never signed any real estate documents, that he could not sell a jointly owned marital asset out from under me. Greg smirked, tapping the document in the folder. He revealed a power of attorney agreement, fully notarized and bearing what looked exactly like my signature. My blood ran completely cold. As a financial auditor, I spent my days hunting down discrepancies and uncovering fraud. I knew exactly what I was looking at. He had forged my signature. He had fabricated a legal document granting himself full control of our shared assets, timing the execution perfectly with my hospitalization. I demanded to know where the money was. The equity from the house, the savings in our joint checking account, the college fund we had started for the baby. Greg smoothly replied that the funds had been transferred to a private account to cover his relocation and legal expenses. He had drained everything. The accounts we built together over 5 years of marriage were completely empty. Brittany stepped out onto the porch, pulling my silk robe tighter around herself. She complained about the cold and asked Greg how much longer this was going to take. She looked at me with open disdain, claiming Greg needed a real partner, not a spreadsheet drone who cared more about auditing numbers than making her husband happy. I ignored her, staring directly at the man I had vowed to spend my life with. I told him I would call the police. I told him I would have him arrested for fraud and forgery, that he would go to prison for what he had just done. Greg laughed. It was the short, humorless sound. He stepped closer, towering over me, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He pointed out that legal battles take months, sometimes years. He noted that I currently did not have a single penny to my name to hire a lawyer. He asked how I planned to fight a drawn-out court battle while trying to keep a newborn baby from starving on the streets. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and let it flutter to the concrete floor of the porch right by my feet. He told me to use it to call a rideshare service and find a shelter. At that exact moment, a large white moving truck turned onto our street and reversed slowly into my driveway. The harsh beeping of the truck's reverse alarm pierced the quiet neighborhood. Two men in work uniforms jumped out of the cab and walked toward the garage. I watched in absolute horror as the garage door rolled up, revealing dozens of cardboard boxes stacked neatly against the wall. They were my belongings. My clothes, my books, my personal files. Everything I owned had been packed into cheap cardboard and shoved into the garage while I was pushing our child into the world. Greg snapped his fingers at the moving crew, instructing them to carry the boxes down to the curb. He turned his back on me, guided Brittany back inside the warm, brightly lit foyer, and shut the heavy wooden door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. I was left standing on the freezing pavement. The wind whipped around me, biting through my clothes. My daughter began to cry, a thin, hungry wail that tore at my heart. The moving crew began dumping my cardboard boxes onto the wet grass near the sidewalk, indifferent to my situation. I watched as the bottom of a box containing my college textbooks soaked up the freezing puddle beneath it. A luxury SUV belonging to the property management company hired by the anonymous buyer pulled in behind the moving truck. At the time, I had no way to know that the buyer was a shell company controlled by Greg. All I saw was a woman in a camel coat step out of the passenger side and wave impatiently for me to clear the driveway. With trembling knees holding my crying infant tight against my chest, I bent down and picked up the crumpled cash. I had to survive this day before I could destroy him for it. A woman in a camel coat stepped out of the passenger side, her face twisted in disgust. She waved a manicured hand, gesturing for me to move off the driveway. I stood paralyzed, the biting wind whipping my unwashed hair across my face. I was only days out of a hospital bed, my core muscles weak, and my stitches burning with a sharp ache that radiated down my legs. Every instinct told me to sink to the cold concrete and weep, but the tiny weight of my daughter against my chest forced me to remain standing. I clutched her tighter. Just as I took a shaky step toward the sidewalk, the heavy front door of my home swung open one last time. Brittany stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing my expensive yoga pants and a cashmere sweater I had bought. She held my leather work purse in one hand and my daughter's diaper bag in the other. Without hesitation, she tossed both bags off the porch. They landed with a heavy thud on the frost-covered grass. Brittany crossed her arms, her gaze raking up and down my exhausted postpartum body. Her lips curled into a sneer. She told me to stop looking so pathetic. She claimed Greg had been miserable for years, tired of coming home to a soulless spreadsheet drone who cared more about auditing financial records than keeping her husband satisfied. She smoothed down the front of my cashmere sweater and stated that Greg finally had the real woman he deserved. Before I could respond, Greg appeared behind her. He did not look at me. He simply wrapped his arm around her waist, pulled her back inside the brightly lit foyer, and slammed the door. The deadbolt slid into place with a heavy metallic thud that signaled the end of my previous life. The woman in the camel coat took a step toward me, offering a tight smile that barely concealed her irritation. She asked if I needed them to call someone, her tone making it crystal clear that she just wanted me off her lawn. I shook my head, unable to speak, and knelt down on the wet grass to retrieve my purse and the diaper bag. The cold seeped through my sweatpants. I slung the heavy diaper bag over my shoulder, my daughter still crying against my collarbone. I dragged myself to the edge of the sidewalk, creating a small distance between myself and the chaotic scene of strangers moving into the house I had paid for. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manipulate the zipper of my purse. I pulled out my phone and wallet. Greg had claimed he drained the accounts, but the auditor in my brain refused to accept such a catastrophic blow without seeing the raw data for myself. I opened my banking app, praying for a delay in the wire transfers or a forgotten savings account. When the dashboard finally materialized on the screen, the breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. The joint checking account showed a balance of 0. The savings account we had built over 5 years showed a balance of 0. The balances sat there in stark, undeniable black and white. Desperation clawed at my throat. I pulled my primary credit card from my wallet, hoping to quickly book a hotel room, a rental car, anything to get my baby out of the freezing wind. I tapped the screen to open the credit card portal. The red banner read that the account had been closed by the primary account holder. I checked the second card. Closed. I checked the corporate travel card, then remembered it had been automatically suspended when my maternity leave began. Greg had not just planned a departure. He had executed a flawless, aggressive financial assassination. He had weaponized his knowledge of our shared finances to ensure I had absolutely no means of immediate retaliation or survival. The plastic cards in my wallet were completely useless. They were nothing more than colorful pieces of trash. The reality of my situation crashed down upon me with suffocating weight. I was standing on a suburban sidewalk in the freezing cold, physically broken from childbirth, holding a hungry infant, with zero access to my own money. The only currency I possessed in the entire world was the crumpled $100 bill Greg had tossed at my feet like I was a beggar. My daughter let out a sharp wail, her tiny face turning red with frustration and cold. I unzipped my cardigan and tucked her inside, pressing her directly against my skin, wrapping the thick wool fabric around her to block the biting wind. I whispered quiet, soothing promises against the top of her head. I promised her she would be warm soon. I promised her she would be fed. I promised her I would never let anyone hurt her. I looked up and down the street. A neighbor I had known for 3 years, a woman who had attended my baby shower just weeks ago, pulled out of her driveway 2 houses down. She slowed her car as she approached, her eyes widening as she took in the scene of my boxes on the curb, the moving truck and me standing on the sidewalk clutching a crying baby. For a split second I thought she might stop. I thought she might ask if I was okay. Instead, her gaze darted to the new owners on the porch, then back to the road. She accelerated, driving past me without a word, avoiding getting involved in the uncomfortable reality of someone else's ruined life. The isolation was absolute. There would be no rescue party coming for me. I could not stay on this sidewalk waiting for a miracle, and I could not afford to waste a single cent of that $100 bill on an overpriced rideshare to a destination I had not yet figured out. I had to secure shelter, and I had to secure cash. The pristine, useless debit cards in my wallet mocked my predicament. My eyes fell on my left hand currently clutching the strap of the diaper bag. The platinum diamond wedding ring on my fourth finger caught the pale winter sunlight. It was a heavy, substantial piece of jewelry, a symbol of a promise that had just been shattered beyond repair. It was no longer a symbol of love. It was a highly liquid asset. I knew there was a pawn shop in the commercial district about 2 miles away. The distance felt insurmountable given my physical condition. Every step I took sent a jolt of pain through my healing abdomen, and the cold was seeping deep into my bones. But my daughter's hungry cries left no room for self-pity. I adjusted the heavy diaper bag on my shoulder, wrapped my arms tightly around the bundle inside my cardigan, and turned my back on the house that was no longer mine. I had no other choice. I began the long, agonizing walk toward the commercial district, clutching that crumpled $100 bill, leaving my old life behind on the frozen front grass. The 2 miles felt like an eternity. Every gust of wind sliced through my hospital cardigan, making my teeth chatter. I kept my head down, placing one foot in front of the other. The sidewalks were slick with black ice, forcing me to walk with caution to protect the tiny life strapped to my chest. My daughter had cried herself to sleep, her warm breath serving as the only tether keeping me from collapsing. By the time the neon sign of the local pawn shop came into view through the gray afternoon light, my legs were shaking violently. I leaned against the cold brick facade to catch my breath. A brass bell jingled as I pushed the glass door open. The shop smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent lighting, settling on glass display cases filled with discarded electronics and tarnished jewelry. A man with a thick gray beard looked up from a small television behind the cluttered counter. He did not greet me. He watched with bored indifference as I approached the scuffed glass. My fingers were so numb from the freezing temperatures that I struggled to pull the platinum and diamond ring from my left hand. For 5 years, that ring had represented security partnership and a future I believed was bulletproof. Now it was nothing more than a piece of cold metal. I placed it on the scratched velvet mat on the counter and pushed it toward the owner. I told him I needed cash immediately. He picked up the ring, screwing a magnifying loupe into his right eye. He turned it slowly under a bright desk lamp, grunting softly. He did not ask about the baby strapped to my chest or the dried tears on my pale face. He tossed the ring back onto the velvet mat with a loud clatter and offered me a sum that made my stomach drop completely. It was barely 5% of what Greg had bragged about spending on it. I protested, my voice cracking. I explained the flawless clarity of the central diamond and the heavy weight of the solid platinum band. I told him it was worth 10 times his insulting offer. He shrugged, picked up a remote control, and turned the volume up on his television set. He stated that it was a buyer's market, and I was welcome to take my business elsewhere. We both knew I did not have the physical strength to walk to another shop. My daughter shifted against my chest, letting out a soft, hungry whimper. That sound broke whatever fight I had left inside me. I nodded once, accepting the cruel reality of my situation. I took the thin stack of $20 bills he slid across the counter, shoving them into my pocket alongside the crumpled $100 bill. It was just enough to buy a train ticket to my parents' house, and perhaps a few small cans of formula to get us through the night. The train station was a chaotic maze of rushing commuters and blaring overhead announcements. The sudden rush of warm air inside the terminal hit my frozen skin like a physical weight. The cavernous hall echoed loudly with the clatter of rolling suitcases and the sharp clicking of dress shoes on marble floors. I navigated carefully through the sea of people, keeping one protective hand over the back of my daughter's head. I found the main ticketing area and joined the back of a long, slow-moving line. I spent the agonizing wait time calculating my meager funds. The train ticket to my parents' town would consume almost everything the pawnshop owner had given me. I had exactly enough money left over for one bottle of ready-to-feed infant formula from the station pharmacy and a cheap cup of black coffee to thaw my freezing hands. My parents would be furious when I showed up on their doorstep unannounced, but they were my absolute only option. They had a warm guest room and fresh food. They were my safety net. As I inched closer to the front of the line, the muffled sounds of a tense argument broke through the station noise. I peered around the tall businessman standing directly in front of me. At the primary ticket window, an elderly man was pleading desperately with the agent behind the thick plexiglass. He was a striking figure despite his disheveled appearance. He wore a heavy wool trench coat that was smeared with dark dirt along the left shoulder, as if he had been violently pushed to the ground. His silver hair was mussed, and a small cut above his eyebrow was swelling. He leaned close to the metal microphone on the glass partition, his voice trembling slightly, but retaining a deep sense of dignity. He explained that he had just been mugged 3 blocks away from the station entrance. He told the ticket agent that his leather wallet, his cell phone, and all his identification had been taken by the assailants. He was asking with a quiet desperation that perfectly mirrored my own internal state for a single train ticket back to the city. He promised earnestly that he could wire the funds directly to the station by the end of the day. The ticket agent, a young man with a profoundly bored expression and an aggressively chewed fingernail, shook his head dismissively. He tapped the laminated policy sign taped securely to the glass. He stated loudly that company policy strictly required valid payment upfront and government-issued identification for all printed passenger tickets. He told the elderly man that he was holding up the line of paying customers and needed to step aside immediately. The old man gripped the bottom edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white from the immense pressure. He explained again that he was completely stranded, that it was dangerously below freezing outside, and that he simply needed to get safely home. His voice cracked with a raw vulnerability that sent a sharp pang of empathy straight through my aching chest. He was stripped of his resources, standing helpless in a public place, entirely at the mercy of someone who lacked the capacity to care. I recognized that exact feeling. I had felt it on my own frozen front porch just hours ago. The ticket agent sighed, reaching for the red telephone on his desk. He spoke a few muffled words. Less than a minute later, two large station security guards approached the counter. They flanked the elderly man closely. The taller guard grabbed the old man roughly by his dirt-stained shoulder. He told him it was time to leave right now, pulling him forcefully away from the plexiglass window. The old man stumbled backward, his polished shoes slipping on the smooth marble floor. He looked around the terminal, his eyes wide with profound shock and deep humiliation. Not a single person in the long line stepped forward to help. People actively averted their gaze, avoiding the uncomfortable reality of his distress. I stood completely paralyzed. I reached into my coat pocket, my frozen fingers brushing against the thin stack of bills from the pawn shop. I looked down at my sleeping daughter, her fragile body dependent on that money for our safe journey. The guards shoved the old man toward the massive glass exit doors. I tightened my grip on the cash, realizing I was forced to make an impossible choice. I stepped out of the long line and moved directly between the taller security guard and the elderly man. I raised my hand, holding the thin stack of $20 bills up where the ticket agent could clearly see them. I stated in a loud voice that I would be paying for his ticket. The guard released the old man's stained shoulder, immediately taking a step back in surprise. The ticket agent rolled his eyes, letting out a loud sigh. He began typing aggressively and asked for the destination without looking up. The old man gave the name of a major transit hub in the city. I slid the cash into the small metal tray. The agent snatched the worn bills, processed the transaction with unnecessary force, and slid a printed paper ticket back to me, along with $3.40 in change. I gathered the coins and handed the ticket to the man. He looked from the paper to my face in absolute disbelief. He asked why I was doing this, gesturing to the sleeping infant strapped to my chest. I told him we could discuss it on the train, noting that our line was boarding in less than 10 minutes. I walked quickly toward the small pharmacy kiosk near the terminal gates, the old man following quietly behind me. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated rows of overpriced snacks and travel supplies. My physical exhaustion was setting in deep. Every step sent a jolt of burning pain through my healing abdomen, reminding me of the hospital bed I had occupied just days prior. I found the baby care aisle and picked up a single bottle of liquid infant formula. It was the cheapest option available. I placed it on the counter along with my $3.40. The cashier rang it up without a word. It covered the total cost with exactly a dime to spare. I pocketed the coin, unscrewed the cap, and attached the sterile rubber nipple. I fed my daughter as we moved through the crowded station, her eager swallows serving as the only sound anchoring me to reality. We boarded the train just as the heavy doors were preparing to slide closed. The heated air of the carriage washed over my freezing face, causing my cheeks to prickle with warmth. I found an empty row of seats near the back of the car and sank into the worn blue upholstery. The exhaustion of the day finally caught up with my body. Every muscle ached, and my stitches throbbed with a persistent burning sensation. The old man took the seat directly across the aisle from me, smoothing down the wrinkled lapels of his dirt-stained trench coat. The train lurched forward with a heavy mechanical groan, pulling out of the bright station and into the dark, frozen landscape. The rhythmic clacking of the steel wheels provided a steady backdrop as my daughter finished her formula, let out a soft sigh, and drifted back to a peaceful sleep against my chest. The man watched me carefully from across the aisle. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and deeply assessing, contrasting sharply with his disheveled exterior. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his knees. He formally introduced himself as Harrison Caldwell. He apologized sincerely for not introducing himself earlier, explaining that the shock of the mugging had left him temporarily disoriented. He thanked me again for the ticket. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. He pointed out that I was traveling with a newborn baby carrying no luggage other than a scuffed diaper bag and clearly operating in a state of extreme distress. He asked why a mother in my precarious position would willingly give away her last dollar to a complete stranger in a train station. I looked out the large window at the passing city lights, watching the reflection of my own tired face in the dark glass. I did not cry. The tears had been frozen out of me hours ago while standing on my front porch. I turned my attention back to the aisle and looked Harrison directly in the eyes. I told him my husband had just sold our house out from under me using forged documents. I explained that he had drained our bank accounts and left me on the street to start a new life with his mistress. I stated coldly that I refused to let my child see her mother lose her humanity simply because her father had lost his. Harrison sat perfectly still, absorbing the heavy weight of my words. He did not offer hollow platitudes or useless pity. Instead, he studied the deliberate lack of hysteria in my voice and the clinical precision with which I summarized my catastrophic situation. He noted aloud that I analyzed the devastating events like a professional assessing a damaged corporate ledger. He asked exactly what I did for a living. I told him I was a financial auditor. I explained that my entire career was built on tracing missing funds, identifying corporate fraud, and holding people strictly accountable for numerical discrepancies. I told him I spent my days hung down, missing money, and exposing liars. A shift occurred in Harrison's demeanor. The vulnerability of the mugging victim faded away, instantly replaced by the calculating presence of a man who evaluated assets and human potential for a living. He asked for my full name. I gave it to him without hesitation. I was Meredith, a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose but a reputation for precision. The train ride lasted another 40 minutes. We spent the remainder of the journey in a comfortable silence. I focused entirely on the rhythmic breathing of my daughter, gathering the mental strength I would need for the impending confrontation with my parents. Harrison remained seated across from me, his sharp gaze occasionally dropping to the worn diaper bag at my feet, or the empty ring finger on my left hand. He seemed to commit every single detail of my situation to memory. The speaker crackled to life, announcing the arrival at my destination. It was a quiet suburban stop miles away from the bustling city center. I stood up carefully, supporting the sleeping baby with one arm while hoisting the diaper bag onto my shoulder. Harrison stood up as well. He extended his hand across the aisle. I shook it, feeling a surprising strength in his grip. He looked at me with an intensity that commanded attention. He told me that people who consistently maintain their integrity when they have every excuse to abandon it are the most dangerous people to cross. He wished me luck. I thanked him, stepped off the train, and walked out into the freezing night air. The walk to my parents' house was another mile through winding streets. I pulled my cardigan tighter around the baby, focusing entirely on putting one foot in front of the other. I did not look back at the station. I did not see Harrison Caldwell standing on the illuminated platform, ignoring his own connecting train to watch me disappear into the shadows. I was unaware that he had pulled a pen from his pocket and was writing my full name and profession on the back of his ticket stub. I just kept walking quietly, stepping forward into the bitter, freezing cold, mentally preparing to face the family I desperately hoped would finally be my absolute salvation tonight. The suburban streets of my neighborhood were deathly quiet. Streetlights cast long shadows across the frozen lawns as I navigated the familiar turns. Every step sent a jolt of searing pain through my healing body, reminding me I should still be in a hospital bed, not trudging through ice. My daughter remained tucked safely inside my cardigan, her quiet breathing the only rhythm keeping me moving forward. My legs felt heavy and unresponsive, but the image of my parents' warm living room pushed me onward. I envisioned my mother wrapping me in a blanket and my father dialing his attorney to demand justice. That desperate fantasy was the only thing fueling my final steps up their long concrete driveway. The house looked exactly the same as it had for 30 years. The white siding gleamed under the porch light, the manicured bushes perfectly trimmed despite the frost. I climbed the 3 brick steps to the front door, my chest heaving with exertion. My fingers were too numb to grasp the brass knocker, so I hit the door with my fist. I knocked 3 times, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet night. I waited, shivering violently, praying they were still awake. A moment later, the porch light flickered overhead and the heavy wooden door swung inward. My parents stood in the entryway. My mother, Barbara, wore her silk pajamas and a perfectly styled robe. My father, Thomas, stood just behind her, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. The blast of warm air escaping from the house hit my face, smelling faintly of cinnamon and pine. I stepped forward instinctively, craving the heat, but my mother did not step aside. She did not open her arms or let out a gasp of maternal concern. She simply stood planted in the center of the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked at my damp hair, my thin hospital cardigan, and the small bundle clutched to my chest. Her eyes narrowed in a mixture of profound annoyance and deep disapproval. I stood frozen on the welcome mat, confused by the physical barrier they were presenting. I told them I needed to come inside. My voice cracked raw from the cold and the sheer trauma of the day. I explained that Greg had locked me out. I told them he used a forged power of attorney to sell our house while I was recovering in the maternity ward. I explained he had drained our joint accounts, leaving me with absolutely nothing, and moved his mistress into the home we built. I summarized the horrific events of the afternoon with a desperate, frantic clarity, expecting their faces to twist into absolute outrage. I waited for my father to pull me inside and swear he would destroy the man who had abandoned his daughter and newborn granddaughter on the street. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the porch. My father looked down at his slippers, shifting his weight uncomfortably. My mother let out a long, dramatic sigh. It was the exact same sigh she used to give me when I brought home an A- instead of a perfect score in high school. She uncrossed her arms and rested her hands on her hips. She did not ask if the baby was warm enough. She did not ask if I was in physical pain. She looked me directly in the eyes and stated that she was not entirely surprised by any of this. The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I asked her what she meant, my voice barely a whisper. My mother leaned forward, her tone dripping with practiced condescension. She told me that I had been driving Greg away for years. She claimed I was always far too obsessed with my auditing career, constantly buried in spreadsheets and corporate reports, instead of focusing on keeping my husband happy. She stated that a man like Greg needed a traditional attentive partner, not a woman who prioritized catching financial discrepancies over cooking a decent meal. She said I had neglected my marriage to climb the corporate ladder, and now I was simply facing the natural consequences of my own selfish choices. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, entirely unable to process the magnitude of her betrayal. I reminded her that Greg had committed multiple felonies. I told her he had stolen my life savings, committed real estate fraud, and abandoned his own child. I asked how she could possibly blame me for the criminal actions of a cheating thief. My father finally stepped forward, placing a hand on my mother's shoulder. He looked at me with a cold, evaluating stare. He told me I needed to stop throwing around words like fraud and theft just because my feelings were hurt. He smoothed the lapels of his robe and revealed that Greg had actually called them earlier that afternoon. My heart stopped. Greg had called them and they had listened. My father explained that Greg had just been appointed as the chief financial officer for a massive corporate firm downtown. He noted proudly that the firm belonged to his new fiancé's father. My father spoke of Greg's new position with a tone of deep reverence and unmistakable respect. He implied heavily that Greg was ascending to the upper echelons of corporate wealth and influence. He looked at my worn sweatpants and shivering frame, making it abundantly clear that he viewed Greg as the ultimate winner in this scenario, while I was nothing more than a pathetic embarrassment standing on his porch. He told me that successful men do not settle for wives who constantly challenge them, and that Greg was simply upgrading his life to match his new corporate status. The street lights hummed quietly in the background as the reality of my family dynamic shattered completely. They were not my safety net. They were part of the very system that had allowed Greg to feel comfortable discarding me. They worshipped status, wealth, and traditional appearances far more than they valued their own flesh and blood. They had actively chosen to align themselves with a successful executive who had stolen from me, rather than support the daughter who had worked herself to the bone trying to make them proud. I stood gripping my baby tighter. I told them I just needed a place to sleep for the night so I could figure out my next steps. I asked them to let me into my childhood bedroom just until the morning. My mother glanced back into the pristine, decorated house. She frowned, stating that my old room had recently been converted into a home gym, and they could not risk me tracking mud and snow onto the new carpets. She said having a crying infant in the main house would disrupt my father's sleep schedule, and he had an important golf game scheduled for the morning. My father stepped past my mother and pointed a stiff finger toward the side of the house. He indicated the heavy wooden door that led down to the unfinished basement. It was a dark, drafty space with concrete floors, exposed pipes, and virtually no insulation against the harsh winter cold. He looked back at me, his expression entirely devoid of any parental warmth or basic human empathy. He locked his jaw and delivered his final crushing condition. "You can stay down there, but you pay rent starting Monday." The next 2 weeks were an absolute living hell. I paid them my last remaining dollars from the pawn shop just to secure a spot on a stained mattress in the freezing basement. I spent my days wrapped in old moving blankets, holding my daughter against my chest for body heat, desperately searching for auditing positions on my phone. The physical cold was agonizing, but the psychological torture from upstairs was far worse. Thomas and Barbara engaged in a relentless campaign of gaslighting. Every time I ventured upstairs to boil water for formula, they made loud, pointed comments about Greg's massive success. They praised his new corporate title and wealthy new extended family, wishing they had a son-in-law who knew how to provide. They treated me like an infectious disease, avoiding eye contact and complaining about my negative energy. The basement did not contain a working sink, so every feeding required a trip upstairs. Barbara began timing those visits. If I remained in the kitchen longer than 5 minutes, she accused me of invading their privacy. She refused to let me store formula in the main refrigerator because she said baby supplies made the shelves look cluttered. I kept bottles inside a plastic cooler beside the mattress and refreshed the melting ice whenever Thomas permitted me to use the freezer. On the fourth night, my daughter developed a shallow cough. I asked my parents to drive us to an urgent care clinic because freezing rain had made the roads dangerous and I had no money for transportation. Thomas did not look away from the television. He said gasoline was expensive and suggested I call Greg because fathers were supposed to handle medical expenses. Barbara added that perhaps seeing his sick child would remind him why I needed to apologize. I wrapped my daughter in 3 blankets and walked to the clinic myself. The doctor said she was not seriously ill, but warned that a newborn should not be sleeping in a damp, unheated room. The following morning, I placed the discharge sheet on the kitchen counter and asked to move into the guest room for the baby's safety. Barbara folded the paper without reading it. She said the basement was perfectly adequate and accused me of manufacturing a crisis to manipulate them. Thomas demanded another week of rent in advance. I sold the last useful items from my diaper bag online, a portable breast pump, a silver bracelet from college, and the noise-canceling headphones I once used during audit travel. The money covered formula clinic fees and Thomas's rent. Each sale felt like another small demolition of the person I had been, but it also hardened something inside me. I stopped expecting rescue. I began documenting every conversation with my parents in a notes file, recording dates, demands, and threats with the same precision I once applied to corporate misconduct. On the 3rd day, I called my employer and learned that Greg had accessed my email while I was hospitalized and submitted a resignation in my name. Human Resources had processed it, and reversing the decision would require an internal investigation I could not manage from a basement floor. Late at night, while my daughter slept against my chest, I submitted new applications online. Every rejection became another humiliation I intended to survive. I did not yet know how we would escape, but I promised myself I would be ready when an opportunity appeared. The cruelty reached its absolute peak on a Friday evening. My parents were hosting a lavish dinner party for their country club friends. I sat in the dim light of the basement, listening to the muffled sounds of jazz music and clinking crystal glasses drifting through the floorboards. Then a booming, familiar laugh echoed from the kitchen directly above my head. My blood ran completely cold. It was Greg. My parents had invited the man who stole my home to their elegant dinner party. Earlier that afternoon, my mother had come down the basement stairs and explicitly banned me from coming up to the main floor for the rest of the night. She claimed my depressing mood and haggard appearance would completely ruin the festive atmosphere of her gathering. She prioritized the comfort of my abuser over the dignity of her own daughter. I sat on the freezing concrete floor listening to the man who ruined my life, charm my parents' friends, rage building inside my chest until it solidified into something cold, dark, and utterly unbreakable. I waited until the final guest departed, and the front door clicked shut. I climbed the wooden basement stairs, my healing body, protesting every movement, and pushed open the door to the kitchen. Thomas and Barbara were loading expensive china into the dishwasher, sipping the last of their wine. I did not yell. I asked them how they could possibly invite a man who committed multiple felonies against their daughter into their home. My mother turned around, her face flushed with wine and arrogance. She reached into the pantry, pulled out a heavy-duty black garbage bag, and threw it forcefully onto the kitchen island. She told me she was entirely sick of my constant victim mentality. She stated that Greg was a successful, powerful man who had graciously offered to maintain a relationship with the family despite my catastrophic failures as a wife. She issued her final devastating ultimatum. She told me I had exactly 24 hours to go to Greg's new corporate office, beg him on my knees for forgiveness, and ask him to take me back as his mistress. If I refused to humble myself and secure a permanent connection to his newfound wealth, I was to put my things in the garbage bag and get out of her house forever. My father stood silently by the sink, polishing a wine glass, tacitly approving every single word she said. They were demanding I sacrifice the last shred of my human dignity to appease their insatiable greed for social status. They wanted me to submit to a thief just so they could brag about his corporate title at their country club luncheons. I looked at the black plastic garbage bag sitting on the marble island. I looked at the two strangers standing in the kitchen, realizing they were completely morally bankrupt. I did not argue. I did not plead for my childhood bedroom or a shred of parental love. I simply picked up the garbage bag, turned my back on them, and walked down the stairs to the freezing basement. I packed the baby formula I had left, the thin blanket, and my daughter's spare clothes into the plastic bag. I strapped my baby tightly to my chest, securing her inside my hospital cardigan. I walked back up the stairs, moving with a stiff, deliberate purpose. I marched straight through the kitchen past my stunned parents and headed directly for the front foyer. My mother shouted after me, threatening that if I walked out that door, she would disown me completely and ensure I never saw a dime of their estate. I did not pause my stride. I gripped the brass handle, pulled the heavy front door open, and stepped out into the freezing, torrential rain of the dark suburban night. I walked down the driveway, the black garbage bag slapping against my leg, leaving the toxic wreckage of my family behind me permanently. I had nowhere to go but would never look back. The icy rain immediately plastered my hair to my face and seeped through the thin wool of my hospital cardigan. I curled my shoulders inward, creating a human shield over my daughter to ensure she stayed dry and warm against my skin. The heavy black garbage bag slapped against my thigh with every step. My sneakers hit the puddles accumulating on the suburban sidewalk, splashing cold water up my ankles. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. I had absolutely no destination in mind. My debit cards were still deactivated. My pockets were completely empty of cash. I had surrendered my last dime days ago to pay the basement rent my father had so ruthlessly demanded. I walked for what felt like hours, though it was likely only 15 minutes. The adrenaline that had propelled me out of my parents' kitchen was beginning to fade rapidly, replaced by a terrifying hollow dread. My stitches burned fury, a sharp, tearing sensation that forced me to slow my pace to a painful limp. The dark reality of my situation was closing in around me like a physical vice. I was walking down a deserted street in a freezing downpour with a newborn baby, completely destitute and entirely alone. The urge to collapse onto a wet suburban lawn and simply give up was overwhelming. As I approached the intersection of the main avenue, a brilliant flash of light cut through the heavy curtain of rain. A pair of intense LED headlights illuminated the slick dark road, temporarily blinding me. I stopped on the corner, shifting my daughter's weight and squinting through the downpour. A massive, sleek black limousine turned onto the street. It moved with a silent, heavy grace, its tires hissing smoothly over the wet asphalt. I stepped back onto the wet grass to give the oversized vehicle plenty of room to pass, assuming it was a wealthy neighbor returning from a corporate gala or an elite airport service. Instead of continuing down the avenue, the limousine slowed down abruptly. It angled its long, polished chassis toward the curb, its tires splashing a wave of cold puddle water directly onto the sidewalk just inches from my soaked sneakers. The vehicle came to a complete halt right in front of me. The tinted rear windows reflected the dim amber glow of the streetlights. The engine purred with a low, powerful hum that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. My heart hammered against my ribs. Instinctively, I tightened my grip on my baby and took another step backward into the shadows of a large oak tree. I had no idea who was inside, but a woman alone on a dark street had every reason to be cautious. The driver's side door clicked open. A man stepped out into the driving rain. He wore a crisp, tailored black suit and a matching chauffeur's cap. He did not rush or look annoyed by the terrible weather. He moved to the rear passenger door with practiced military precision, opening a large, heavy-duty black umbrella as he walked. He grasped the chrome handle of the back door and pulled it open, holding the umbrella high to shield the interior from the storm. The soft, warm glow of the limousine's cabin light spilled out onto the wet pavement. For a moment, I could only see the impeccable leather interior. Then a polished leather Oxford shoe stepped out onto the curb. A man emerged from the back seat, standing tall beneath the protection of the driver's umbrella. He wore an immaculate, bespoke charcoal gray suit with a subtle pinstripe. A silk pocket square rested perfectly in his breast pocket. His silver hair was neatly combed, framing a face characterized by sharp, intelligent eyes and an aura of absolute terrifying authority. He looked like a man who commanded boardrooms and dictated the flow of global markets. He looked nothing like the disheveled, dirt-stained mugging victim I had encountered at the train station 2 weeks prior. I froze, the heavy garbage bag slipping slightly from my shoulder. My mind struggled to reconcile the image of the helpless old man I had sacrificed my last dollar for with the corporate titan standing before me. Harrison Caldwell looked at my soaked clothing, the black trash bag clutched in my fist, and the protective way I was shielding my infant from the rain. He did not look surprised to see me walking in a storm. He looked exactly like a man who had anticipated this very moment and arrived precisely on time. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. The warmth of that expression stood in stark contrast to the bitter cold of the night. He stated simply that he had promised to pay me back for the train ticket. His deep voice cut effortlessly through the sound of the pouring rain. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the luxurious, heated interior of the limousine. He told me to get in. He looked directly into my eyes, his tone shifting from polite gratitude to cold, calculated business. He informed me that we had an empire to dismantle. The sheer absurdity of his statement hung in the freezing air, battling the roar of the pouring rain. I stood paralyzed on the wet concrete, the heavy black garbage bag anchoring me to the miserable reality I had just been thrown out of. My mind, trained to process data and calculate risks, completely short-circuited. I stared at Harrison Caldwell, searching his sharp, composed features for any sign of a cruel joke or a trap. How was a phantom of wealth standing in the middle of a flooded suburban street, offering me a lifeline that felt entirely too good to be true? The suited driver remained perfectly still, holding the massive black umbrella over Harrison with unwavering dedication. The rain battered against the waterproof canopy, sounding like a drumline. Harrison did not break eye contact. He did not rush me. He simply waited, radiating an aura of absolute patience and unshakable control. He glanced down at the small, shivering lump tucked inside my soaked hospital cardigan. My daughter let out a weak, raspy whimper, her tiny body trembling violently against my chest as the damp cold began to seep through the layers of wool and cotton. That sound broke through my paralysis. The analytical auditor in my brain ran a rapid, desperate calculation. Behind me lay a dark, freezing street and a set of parents who had demanded rent for a concrete floor while praising the man who had robbed me. In front of me was a heated luxury vehicle and a man who, despite his mysterious transformation, owed me a debt and was offering shelter. The maternal instinct to protect my child violently overrode my professional skepticism. I tightened my grip on the heavy plastic garbage bag, adjusted the baby against my collarbone, and took a cautious step forward. Harrison immediately stepped back, making room for me to enter the wide illuminated cabin of the limousine. The driver shifted the umbrella smoothly, shielding me from the downpour as I ducked my head and climbed inside. The sensory transition was staggering. The moment I crossed the threshold of the vehicle, the bitter, biting cold was instantly replaced by a wave of glorious, enveloping heat. The air smelled of rich, conditioned leather, subtle cedar cologne, and absolute cleanliness. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the stale cigarette smoke of the pawn shop and the damp mildew of my parents' basement. I slid onto the plush leather bench, my soaked sneakers sinking into the thick, immaculate carpeting. The driver shut the heavy door with a solid, airtight thud. Instantly, the howling wind and the violent drumming of the rain were silenced, reduced to a faint, distant hum. The acoustic isolation of the cabin was profound. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the chaotic noise of my collapsing world was completely muted. Harrison climbed in through the opposite door, settling into the rear-facing seat directly across from me. He moved with the fluid, confident grace of a man who owned the space he occupied. He reached over to a polished mahogany console built into the side panel and pressed a silver button. A hidden compartment glided open, revealing a stack of thick, heated cotton towels. He pulled out 3 of them and handed them across the wide aisle. I took them with shaking hands, murmuring a quiet, breathless thank you. I carefully extracted my daughter from my wet cardigan, wrapping her immediately in the warmest towel. The heat seemed to soothe her instantly. Her whimpering subsided into a soft, contented sigh, and the tight, rigid posture of her tiny limbs began to relax. I draped the second towel over my own soaking hair, shivering uncontrollably as the contrast between my freezing clothes and the warm air hit my nervous system. I was hyper-aware of the damp patches I was leaving on his pristine upholstery, but Harrison waved away my apologetic glance before I could even voice it. He poured a glass of bottled water from a crystal decanter and set it on a small tray table that extended between us. He leaned back in his seat, steepling his fingers together, and watched me with the same intense, evaluating gaze he had used on the train. I took a slow sip of the water, letting the hydration soothe my raw throat. My hands were finally beginning to thaw. The initial shock was wearing off rapidly, replaced by my natural analytical drive. I set the glass down and looked directly at him. I demanded an explanation. I asked him how a man who required a donated train ticket 2 weeks ago was now sitting in a custom-built limousine surrounded by private security. I asked him how he had known exactly where to find me on a dark suburban street in the middle of a torrential storm. Harrison offered a small, measured smile. He explained that his appearance at the train station had not been a deception, but a temporary misfortune. He confirmed that he had indeed been mugged, stripped of his wallet, phone, and dignity. He noted that in his circle of extreme wealth, people rarely experienced genuine helplessness. The ticket agent had treated him as a nuisance, and the security guards had treated him as a threat. But I, a woman with a newborn, and nothing but a few crumpled bills to her name, had treated him as a human being. He leaned forward slightly, the ambient light catching the silver threads in his hair. He explained that the moment he returned to his office in the city, he had handed the back of his ticket stub to his executive security team. He had told them to find Meredith, the financial auditor. He revealed that people with his level of resources do not use standard search engines. They employ private investigators and former intelligence officers. Within 48 hours, he possessed a comprehensive dossier on my entire life. He recited the facts of my existence with chilling precision. He knew my maiden name. He knew my exact tenure at my previous accounting firm. He knew the precise figures of the stellar performance reviews I had received over the last 7 years. But more importantly, he knew the devastating details of the last 14 days. He knew about Greg. He knew about the forged power of attorney. He knew about the rapid cash sale of the house, the drained joint accounts, and the sudden suspiciously lucrative promotion Greg had secured at a rival corporate firm. He even knew about my parents, Thomas and Barbara, and the cruel conditional nature of their so-called support. He explained that his security team had been monitoring my location since I arrived at my parents' house. When I walked out of their front door with a garbage bag in the rain, his driver was already positioned 3 blocks away, waiting for his command to approach. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the surveillance he had deployed. A part of me felt a surge of violation. My darkest, most humiliating secrets had been laid bare and dissected by a team of strangers. But the larger, more dominant part of my brain recognized the incredible power sitting across from me. I stopped shivering. I tightened the towel around my shoulders, sitting up straighter. I looked at Harrison not as a savior but as a potential business partner. I asked him what he wanted from me. Men with his level of power did not dispatch investigators' private security and a limousine simply to repay a train ticket. Harrison's expression sharpened with approval. He said charity interested him far less than transactions, because charity created dependence while a transaction created leverage, loyalty, and measurable results. Then he finally gave me his full name and title. Harrison Caldwell was the founder and chief executive officer of Caldwell Vanguard, a powerful East Coast venture capital firm. His company financed acquisitions, rescued failing corporations, and dismantled fraudulent leadership teams before investing a single dollar. He had spent decades identifying assets everyone else had mispriced. According to him, I was the most undervalued asset he had encountered in years. He opened a slim leather portfolio and placed 3 items on the table between us: a key card, a brass penthouse key, and an employment contract. The key card granted executive access to Caldwell Vanguard's financial systems. The brass key belonged to a corporate penthouse with a private nursery and dedicated staff. The contract offered me the position of senior lead investigator, effective immediately, with salary, legal protection, medical coverage for my daughter, and authority to conduct hostile forensic audits under Harrison's direct supervision. I read every page instead of reaching blindly for the pen. The terms were aggressive but clean. There were no hidden repayment clauses, no claim over future earnings, and no demand for personal loyalty beyond confidentiality and professional integrity. Harrison watched me review the document and said that was precisely why he wanted me. A desperate person would have signed without reading. An auditor checked the fine print while soaked, exhausted, and homeless. My first assignment was printed on the final page. Caldwell Vanguard was evaluating a major investment in the corporation owned by Brittany's father. Because Greg had just become its chief financial officer, the audit would place every ledger he controlled in my hands. I signed my real name. Harrison slid the keys toward me and told the driver to continue to headquarters. As the limousine accelerated toward the city skyline, he promised my daughter would sleep safely that night. By morning, I would no longer be defending the ruins of my old life. I would be examining the financial foundation of Greg's new one. The drive into the city felt like crossing the border into another dimension. The Caldwell Vanguard headquarters was a towering glass monolith in the financial district. Harrison did not take me to a standard office. He escorted me to a private, multi-level corporate penthouse that occupied the top floors of the building. It was a space designed for visiting executives and high-stakes negotiations, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the illuminated city below. A private security detail met us at the elevator, and within an hour, a team of discreet staff had transformed one of the guest suites into a fully equipped luxury nursery. I stood in the center of the massive living room, watching my daughter sleep soundly in a plush-heated crib. The knot of pure panic that had been suffocating me for weeks finally began to loosen. Harrison walked into the room carrying a sleek silver laptop and a stack of encrypted access drives. He set them down on a massive oak dining table that would serve as my command center. He told me that his firm was currently evaluating a massive merger proposal from the corporation, where Greg had just been appointed chief financial officer. He explained that Brittany's father was desperate for Caldwell Vanguard's capital to secure a global expansion, meaning Harrison had unrestricted, legally mandated access to their preliminary financial disclosures. Hy gave me the passwords and told me to tear their ledgers apart. I was no longer a discarded wife begging for shelter. I was an apex predator returning to my natural habitat. Over the next few days, I barely slept. The penthouse became my fortress. I had endless pots of black coffee-catered meals that I ate without tasting, and the quiet, steady breathing of my baby in the next room to keep me anchored. I utilized the elite proprietary financial software that Caldwell Vanguard provided. It was a terrifyingly powerful system capable of tracing global transactions with a speed and clarity I had never experienced at my previous auditing firm. I dove headfirst into the raw data. I pored over thousands of lines of spreadsheets cross-referencing shell company registrations with offshore wire transfers. I scrutinized vendor payouts, quarterly expense reports, and executive compensation packages. I was completely relentless. Every time I felt a wave of exhaustion, I remembered the freezing concrete of my parents' driveway. I remembered the smirk on Brittany's face while she wore my bathrobe. I remembered the exact sound of my front door deadbolt, locking me out of my own life. I channeled all of that agonizing pain directly into the numbers. The initial pass through the corporate ledgers revealed a company that was seemingly profitable, but dangerously overleveraged. Brittany's father was running a tight ship on paper, but the deeper I dug, the more the foundation appeared cracked. I spent my nights cross-referencing the company's public tax filings with their internal expenditure reports. I was looking for the ghost in the machine, the subtle inconsistencies that only a trained auditor knows how to spot. I tracked millions of dollars moving through legitimate operational channels, separating the mundane corporate expenses from the strategic investments. I found duplicated invoices for services that were never rendered, buried deep within the marketing budgets. I found staggered cash withdrawals designed to avoid federal reporting thresholds. It was a textbook skimming operation executed with enough sophistication to fool a standard internal review, but completely transparent to a forensic auditor with unrestricted access and a personal vendetta. By the end of my first week in the penthouse, I hit a massive digital roadblock. I was tracing a series of highly unusual, exorbitant consulting fees paid to a subsidiary firm located overseas. The payments had begun trickling out earlier in the year and had recently escalated into massive lump sums. But when I tried to pull the specific routing data to identify the ultimate beneficiary of those accounts, my screen went black. I had triggered a deeply embedded, highly sophisticated, encrypted firewall. It was a manual block specifically designed by the new chief financial officer to restrict internal access to an elite tier of executive accounts. Harrison's IT team offered to brute force the encryption, but they warned it would take weeks and would likely trigger internal alarms at the target corporation, tipping Greg off to the investigation before we were ready. I stared at the flashing password prompt on my screen. I told the IT team to stand down. I did not need a hacker to break into Greg's accounts. I just needed to remember the man I had married. Greg was incredibly arrogant, but he was also fundamentally lazy. He prided himself on his intelligence, but he was a creature of rigid, predictable habits. During our 5 years of marriage, I had managed all our household finances because Greg despised the tedious nature of passwords and security protocols. He always used variations of the same mathematical sequence, tying them to specific dates he considered monumental to his own ego. He thought he was being clever, but to an auditor who had shared his bed and managed his taxes, he was entirely transparent. I closed my eyes and tuned out the hum of the city below. I walked through Greg's career, his promotions, his childhood address, the numeric patterns he used for his golf club locker, and his personal investment portfolios. I began typing sequences into the prompt. I tried his college graduation date combined with his fraternity chapter number. Access denied. I tried the date he secured his first major corporate deal multiplied by his childhood zip code. Access denied. I paused, letting my fingers hover over the keyboard. I thought about the sheer audacious confidence he displayed when he threw that $100 bill at my feet. I thought about the meticulous way he had forged the power of attorney document to steal our house. I typed in the exact date of his original hiring at his previous firm, followed by the routing number of his oldest personal bank account inverted. The screen froze for a fraction of a second. The red access denied warning vanished. The firewall dissolved completely, granting me unrestricted administrative access to the hidden offshore routing codes. The data flooded onto my screen in real time. I scrolled through the hidden ledgers, my eyes scanning the massive columns of incoming and outgoing wire transfers. I began matching the dates of the offshore deposits to the corresponding domestic withdrawals. The pattern was undeniable. My breath caught in my throat as the true scope of the numbers registered in my brain. I uncovered a glaring, catastrophic anomaly. Greg had not just been appointed to the chief financial officer position as a favor to his new fiancée. He had been systematically manipulating the accounts for nearly 8 months long before the promotion was ever officially announced. I highlighted the routing numbers tracing the offshore consulting fees directly back to a private domestic trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust was Greg. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Greg had been bleeding the company dry from the inside out. He had charmed his way into the family, secured a position of ultimate financial trust, and immediately began dismantling their legacy to line his own pockets. He was using his relationship with Brittany as a cover to siphon massive amounts of capital into his own private reserves. He was not just a cheating husband who had defrauded his wife out of a suburban house. He was currently executing a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme against his new father-in-law's company. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. He believed he was invincible, entirely untouchable by the people he used as stepping stones. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, downloading every single transaction file, every forged digital signature, and every fraudulent wire transfer confirmation. I compiled them into an airtight, irrefutable dossier of corporate theft. I sat back in my leather chair, a cold, predatory calm washing over me. The trap was already set, and Greg had absolutely no idea he was standing right in the center of it. The laser printer in the corner of the dining room hummed to life, breaking the silence of the early morning. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously pulling transaction records from the offshore network, converting digital ghosts into hard, undeniable physical evidence. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the chaos across the oak table. Stacks of paper were organized by date, routing number, and ultimate beneficiary. My eyes burned from staring at the screen all night, but adrenaline made sleep impossible. I had the monster by the throat, and I was not letting go until I mapped every artery of his corruption. I picked up a red pen and began drawing literal lines between the corporate embezzlement and my personal ruin. He had not just stolen from his new employer to build a nest egg. He used the stolen corporate funds to finance the destruction of my life. I traced a wire transfer from the offshore firm back to his domestic trust. The date perfectly aligned with the week I gave birth. From that trust, a cashier's check had been issued to a shell company. I ran the registration and found an agent tied to Greg's private attorney. That shell company was the anonymous buyer who purchased my house using the forged power of attorney. Greg used the embezzled money to buy my house out from under me, paying himself for the property while wiping out my equity. I pulled the expenditure reports linked to the trust and matched them to the lifestyle Greg and Brittany had been flaunting. I found a wire transfer to a luxury auto importer, dated 2 days after I was thrown onto the freezing street. The amount matched the retail price of the twin sports cars parked in their driveway. I found receipts for bespoke suits, country club fees, and first-class tickets. Every luxury they enjoyed was built on stolen capital. Then I found the most enraging line item. It was a staggering 6-figure payment to an exclusive jeweler in the Diamond District. I pulled up the digitized invoice and read the description. It was a custom-designed 4-carat, flawless diamond ring set in a massive platinum band. I thought about Brittany standing on my front porch wearing my custom bathrobe looking at me with pure disdain while holding my stolen life in her hands. That massive, sparkling engagement ring she was flashing to her friends was bought with stolen money. It was a monument to fraud sitting proudly on her finger. I printed the invoice and placed it at the top of the evidence stack. The picture was complete. The heavy oak door of the penthouse clicked open. Harrison Caldwell walked in holding 2 cups of black coffee. He paused, taking in the chaotic spread of documents and the dark circles under my eyes. He set the cups down and picked up the top file. He simply began reading the summaries I had prepared. I stood up, my muscles stiff from sitting for hours. I told him I had everything. I explained the offshore routing loop, the shell companies, and the domestic trust. I pointed to the red lines connecting the theft to the purchase of my home and the engagement ring. I stated that Greg had embezzled over $4 million in 8 months. I reached for my phone, telling Harrison I was going to call the federal authorities right now. I wanted Greg pulled out of his corporate headquarters in handcuffs before lunch. Harrison reached across the table and placed his large hand firmly over mine, stopping me from dialing. His grip was unyielding. He looked at the paperwork, then looked at me, his expression deadly serious. He told me to put the phone down. I stared at him in rising anger. I demanded to know why we were waiting when I had ironclad proof of federal felonies. I argued that the police needed to see this immediately before Greg could move the money. Harrison shook his head slowly. I explained the harsh reality of corporate crisis management. He told me that if I handed this dossier to the police right now, the authorities would contact the victim of the crime, which was the corporation owned by Brittany's father. Harrison warned me that men who run billion-dollar empires hate public scandals. If Brittany's father found out his new son-in-law was a massive liability, his first instinct would be to protect the company's stock price and his family's social reputation. Harrison explained they would sweep it entirely under the rug. Brittany's father would quietly force Greg to resign. They would use their massive legal team to handle the missing funds internally, shielding the company from the devastating public relations nightmare of an embezzlement scandal. Greg would lose his job, but he would slink away quietly into the shadows. He would avoid a public trial, and the enablers would ensure the true magnitude of his crimes never saw the light of day. Harrison looked at me with cold clarity. He stated that bringing this to light required an undeniable drop. We could not hand it over to the authorities in secret. We needed to trap Greg publicly in a setting so heavily populated by influential witnesses that Brittany's father would have absolutely no choice but to throw him to the wolves to save himself. We needed a stage. I sank back into my chair, processing the brutal logic of his strategy. He was right. A quiet arrest would give Greg the opportunity to manipulate the narrative. He needed to be destroyed in the light of day, where his charm could not save him. I asked Harrison how we were supposed to get Greg in front of the right audience. Harrison smiled, a sharp expression mirroring my internal drive. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He tossed it onto the table, right on top of the jeweler's invoice. He told me to open it. I broke the gold wax seal. Inside was an ornate, formal invitation. It was an invitation to a massive elite engagement gala hosted by Brittany's parents in honor of their daughter and her new fiancé, Greg. The date on the invitation was exactly 3 days from now. I looked up at Harrison, my mind racing. I noted that the guest list for this kind of event would include the entire executive board, local politicians, and the city's most elite socialites. It was the perfect audience. But I asked Harrison why he had an invitation to Greg's party. Harrison tapped the heavy cardstock. He explained that Brittany's father was throwing a massive networking event designed to impress the key stakeholders of Caldwell Vanguard. The entire gala was a desperate attempt to secure the major partnership and the critical venture capital funding that Harrison controlled. Brittany's father was trying to court Harrison, and Greg was being paraded as the brilliant new financial mind of the family. The magnitude of the flawless setup settled over me heavily. Greg and Brittany were hosting the biggest night of their lives, completely unaware that the very powerful man they were desperately trying to impress had just hired the woman they threw out on the street. The gala was in exactly 3 days. We had precisely 72 hours to prepare the final devastating strike. Following Harrison's strategy, I needed to make direct contact with Greg. The entire trap required him to feel completely secure in his perceived dominance over me. I picked up my phone and dialed the number I had forced myself to delete just 2 weeks ago. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to slow into a steady rhythm. The line rang 4 times before he finally answered. He sounded breathless and impatient, likely stepping out of a high-level corporate meeting to deal with what he assumed was an annoying nuisance call. I forced my voice to tremble. I let a long, heavy silence hang on the line before I spoke his name. I told him I was completely out of options. I said the meager cash from the pawn shop was gone, and my parents had kicked me out of their drafty basement. I begged him to meet me. Greg let out a long theatrical sigh that crackled through the phone speaker. He complained loudly about his incredibly busy schedule and the massive executive responsibilities of his new corporate position. He acted severely inconvenienced, but the opportunity to gloat over my absolute crushing defeat was clearly too tempting for his narcissism to resist. He agreed to meet me during his lunch hour. He chose a cheap rundown diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, deliberately picking a location where he knew his new elite colleagues would never catch him associating with his destitute former wife. I arrived at the diner 20 minutes early to prepare myself mentally. I wore the exact same thin hospital cardigan I had been wearing the night he locked me out in the freezing rain. I left my hair unbrushed and practiced a posture of complete crushing defeat, slouching my shoulders to make myself look as small and pathetic as possible. The bell above the diner door jingled violently as Greg walked in. He looked completely ridiculous and entirely out of place in the grease-stained establishment. He wore a custom-tailored navy blue suit, a crisp silk tie, and a heavy gold watch that I immediately recognized from the offshore transaction ledgers I had been auditing all night. He slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, keeping his expensive cashmere overcoat securely wrapped around his body to avoid touching the sticky laminate table. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about the health, safety, or whereabouts of our newborn daughter. He simply looked at my exhausted appearance and smiled with a deep, sickening satisfaction. He ordered a black coffee from the waitress without glancing at her and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He told me he did not have much time to waste on my drama. He bragged that he was finalizing the caterers and security details for a massive engagement gala he was hosting this weekend. He boasted that he was about to secure a legendary partnership with one of the most powerful venture capital firms on the East Coast, cementing his financial legacy at his new company. I kept my eyes focused downward, staring at the chipped formica table to hide the intense burning hatred in my gaze. I told him in a small broken whisper that I just needed a little bit of financial help to get a cheap apartment. Greg chuckled, the cold, harsh sound that grated against the clattering dishes and the low hum of the diner kitchen. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document alongside a sleek branded bank envelope. He placed them on the table and pushed them slowly toward me. He stated that he was a generous man, forgiving my constant nagging and career obsession during our marriage. He opened the envelope and revealed a cashier's check made out to my name. The amount was exactly $10,000. It was an insulting microscopic fraction of what he had stolen from my home equity, let alone the $4 million he was currently embezzling from his future father-in-law. But looking closely at the check, my analytical mind caught a crucial detail. The routing number printed at the bottom matched one of the offshore shell accounts I had decrypted just hours ago. He was paying me off with stolen corporate funds. Greg tapped his manicured finger aggressively against the legal document. He explained that the $10,000 came with strict, absolutely non-negotiable conditions. The document was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, tightly combined with a highly unfavorable divorce settlement. He demanded that I sign away any and all future claims to our marital assets, including the house he had already sold. He insisted that I take full public and legal responsibility for the complete failure of our marriage. The contract explicitly stated that my unreasonable dedication to my auditing career and my emotional neglect had driven him away. If I signed it, he promised I could take the check and walk away cleanly. If I refused his generous offer, He threatened to drag the divorce out in family court for years. He promised to hire the most ruthless attorneys in the city to ensure I was completely bankrupt, buried in legal fees, and forced to raise our daughter in a homeless shelter. I looked up at him, letting my eyes fill with manufactured, desperate tears. I played the role of the broken, terrified victim flawlessly. I told him he had won the war. I whispered that he had successfully taken everything from me, and I just wanted to survive the winter. My total submission fed his massive ego like gasoline poured directly onto an open fire. Greg leaned back against the red vinyl booth, radiating pure, unchecked arrogance. He told me this was a necessary lesson in understanding my proper place in the world. He bragged that his financial genius was finally being recognized by elite corporate players who actually mattered. He confidently stated that by next week, after the engagement gala was complete, he would be entirely untouchable, operating at a level of wealth and power I could not even begin to comprehend. He had absolutely no idea that I knew every single detail of his offshore accounts, the forged signatures, and the stolen assets. He was completely unaware that the powerful venture capital firm he was desperately trying to impress was actively funding his total destruction. I reached across the sticky table and picked up the cheap plastic pen the waitress had left with our water glasses. My hand shook violently, a physical manifestation of the pure adrenaline coursing through my veins, which Greg completely misinterpreted as fear. I hovered the pen over the thick black signature line of the non-disclosure agreement. I did not sign my actual legally binding name. I used a subtle, highly specific variation of my signature, omitting my middle initial and looping the final letters backward. It was a deliberate legal technicality I had learned during my years as a forensic auditor that effectively rendered the entire document completely void and unenforceable in any court of law. I pressed down hard, sealing the fake signature into the paper. I slid the fraudulent contract back across the table and picked up the $10,000 check, securing the physical proof of his embezzlement in my pocket. I offered Greg a weak, trembling smile and thanked him for his profound generosity. I stood up from the booth, clutching the damp hospital cardigan around my chest, and walked out of the diner into the cold afternoon air. I left Greg sitting there sipping his black coffee, entirely convinced that he had completely won the game. He thought he had buried his past forever, completely unaware that he had just handed me the final necessary nail for his own coffin. I returned to the Caldwell Vanguard penthouse with Greg's cashier's check sealed inside an evidence sleeve. Harrison's legal team photographed the front and back, verified the routing number, and placed the original in a secure file. The check connected Greg personally to the offshore account more cleanly than any digital record could. He had tried to purchase my silence, but he had instead signed another confession in ink. I had just finished changing out of the hospital cardigan when the private elevator intercom sounded. The building's head of security appeared on the wall screen. His expression was controlled despite the noise behind him. A woman was shouting in the marble lobby, demanding access to her daughter. A man beside her was threatening to call the police and the press if the staff continued treating them like strangers. Thomas and Barbara had found me. I told security not to send them up, but Harrison, who was reviewing the diner recording at the dining table, advised me to end the problem before the gala. He said people like my parents treated every unanswered demand as an opening for negotiation. A boundary only became real when it was enforced in front of them. I authorized the elevator but asked two security officers to accompany them. The doors opened several minutes later. Barbara entered first, wearing a camel coat, pearl earrings, and an inspecting expression. Thomas followed with a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. Both stopped abruptly when they saw the penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the stone floors, executive workstations, and visible nursery. Barbara's surprise lasted only a moment before suspicion replaced it. She looked me up and down in my borrowed silk blouse and tailored trousers. Then she asked what kind of man was paying for everything. The calculated insult made my hands go cold. Thomas scanned the room and demanded to know how many credit cards I had opened since leaving their basement. He warned that living beyond my means would not impress anyone when the bills arrived. I did not defend myself. I asked why they were there. Thomas opened the leather folder and spread several brokerage statements across the table. 2 weeks earlier, one of his country club friends had convinced him to invest heavily in a speculative technology company. Thomas had used their retirement savings borrowed against a home equity line and purchased additional shares on margin because Greg had casually praised the industry during the dinner party. That morning, the company announced an accounting investigation. The share price collapsed before Thomas could sell. Barbara stated the loss as though I had caused it. They needed $180,000 within 5 business days to satisfy the margin call and prevent the lender from placing a lien on their house. She said they had learned from a country club acquaintance that I had been seen entering Caldwell Vanguard with Harrison Caldwell. Since I was clearly receiving money from an older wealthy man, she assumed I could obtain a loan without difficulty. For several seconds, I simply stared at them. They had refused to drive their sick newborn granddaughter to a clinic over the cost of gasoline. They had charged me rent for a stained mattress on a concrete floor. Now they had crossed the city to demand that I rescue the retirement account they had gambled after following Greg's advice. Thomas pushed a prepared loan application toward me. My name had already been typed beneath the borrower section. The requested amount was $200,000, enough to cover the margin call and restore the country club dues they had fallen behind on. He said my signature was the only thing missing. When I did not reach for the pen, his voice hardened. He reminded me that parents made sacrifices for their children and claimed it was time for me to demonstrate family loyalty. I asked him to name one sacrifice they had made for my daughter during the 2 weeks we lived in their basement. Neither answered. Barbara recovered first. She said they had given me shelter when no one else would. She omitted the rent, the freezing room, the garbage bag, and the demand that I become Greg's mistress. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. She warned that if I refused, they would tell everyone Harrison was supporting me in exchange for favors. She said a respectable mother would not want rumors surrounding the fatherless child she was raising. Harrison rose from the dining table before I could respond. He introduced himself in a tone so calm that both of my parents went silent. He clarified that I was not his dependent companion or charity case. I was a contracted senior lead investigator employed by Caldwell Vanguard because of my professional record and forensic skill. He added that the penthouse was secured corporate housing and that the building recorded every defamatory statement. Barbara's face lost its color. Thomas tried to change tactics. He praised my intelligence, said they had always known I would recover, and suggested the loan could be considered an investment in family stability. I looked at the forms on the table and recognized the same entitlement that had allowed Greg to forge my signature. Each of them believed my labor credit and future existed for their use. I picked up the application, tore it cleanly in half, and placed the pieces back inside Thomas's folder. I told them the answer was no. I would not borrow money, guarantee their debt, contact Harrison's bankers, or use my position to repair a reckless trade. Their financial loss was the consequence of their own decision, just as my absence from their lives was the consequence of theirs. They had not gained a wealthy daughter. They had lost a daughter the night they chose a cheating thief over a postpartum mother and her newborn child. Barbara's composure shattered. She shouted that I was ungrateful and declared that she was disowning me. I reminded her that she had already made that threat while I walked into the rain carrying my baby's belongings in a garbage bag. The threat had no remaining value. Thomas grabbed the edge of the table and demanded that I reconsider. He said their house reputation and retirement were at stake. I answered that my child's warmth, health, and safety had been at stake in their basement, and they had still chosen Greg's comfort over ours. I turned toward the security officers and told them the meeting was over. Barbara resisted when they approached, insisting she had a right to remain because I was her daughter. I corrected her one final time. Biology had given her access to my childhood. It did not give her permanent access to my adulthood. The officers escorted both of them into the elevator, while Thomas threatened lawsuits, and Barbara screamed that I would regret humiliating them. The doors closed, cutting off their voices. I stood in the sudden silence, waiting for guilt to arrive. It never did. Through the glass wall, the city stretched beneath me, bright and indifferent. Harrison gathered the torn loan papers and placed them in the shredder. He said the final loose end had been cut. For the first time, I understood that defeating Greg would not be enough. I also had to stop every person who believed they could profit from my pain. I returned to the evidence table, opened the gala file, and began preparing the public end of the war. The memory of walking into the freezing rain with nowhere to go played on an endless loop in my mind as I stood in the center of the Caldwell Vanguard penthouse. I let the phantom chill wash over me one final time, a dark reminder of exactly why I was standing there. That freezing, desperate memory played on an endless loop in my mind as I stood in the center of the Caldwell Vanguard penthouse. I let the phantom chill of the rain wash over me one last time, a dark reminder of exactly why I was standing here today. I took a deep breath, letting the luxurious air fill my lungs, banishing the ghost of that helpless suburban mother forever. Today was the day of the engagement gala. Today, the woman who walked down that driveway clutching a garbage bag was officially dead. The morning light poured through the windows, illuminating the sprawling oak dining table. The table was no longer a chaotic mess of scattered receipts. It was wiped clean, save for 3 immaculate black leather binders resting perfectly in the center. The heavy elevator doors chimed softly, breaking the silence of the morning. Harrison Caldwell stepped into the penthouse. He was dressed in a striking midnight blue tuxedo that radiated absolute authority. He carried a sleek leather portfolio under his arm, followed closely by 2 stern men in dark suits. They were top-tier corporate litigators from his personal legal team. Harrison did not offer a polite morning greeting. He walked straight to the dining table and placed the portfolio down next to my black binders. He looked at me, his sharp eyes evaluating my composed posture. He unclasped the portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of watermarked parchment. He placed it in front of me alongside a heavy gold fountain pen. Harrison explained the magnitude of the document. It was a fully executed, legally binding proxy authorization. By signing it, I would not just be representing Caldwell Vanguard in a peripheral capacity. Harrison was officially granting me unrestricted executive authority to act as his direct proxy and lead financial auditor for the impending acquisition merger with the firm owned by Brittany's father. He told me that for the duration of the evening, my voice would carry the exact same weight as his own. I would possess the unilateral power to approve or permanently terminate a multi-billion-dollar corporate partnership. He looked down at the forged non-disclosure agreement I had tricked Greg into giving me. He noted that Greg thought he had purchased my silence for 10,000 stolen dollars. Harrison slid the gold pen toward my hand. He told me it was time to show them what my silence actually cost. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I signed my true signature across the bottom of the proxy document, sealing my new position with absolute finality. Harrison nodded in approval, handing the document to the litigators who secured it in a locked briefcase. He checked his watch and stated that the gala would commence in exactly 4 hours. He advised me to prepare myself, noting that the crowd we were about to face would be ruthless, judgmental, and highly protective of their own. I told him I was fully aware of the environment we were entering. I turned away from the table and walked toward the master bedroom suite. It was time to shed the final remnants of the woman Greg thought he had destroyed. The transformation was both physical and deeply psychological. A high-end corporate stylist had left a garment bag hanging on the closet door. I unzipped the canvas to reveal a bespoke tailored designer suit in a shade of deep charcoal gray. It was cut with aggressive, sharp lines that projected an image of untouchable power and severe professionalism. I showered, scrubbing away the exhaustion of the past few weeks. I styled my hair into a sleek, severe knot at the nape of my neck, ensuring not a single strand was out of place. I applied my makeup with clinical precision, highlighting the cold, analytical sharpness in my eyes. I slipped into the crisp white silk blouse. I slid the heavy charcoal blazer over my shoulders, feeling the structured fabric act as a literal suit of armor. I stepped into a pair of black pointed stiletto heels that echoed with a sharp, authoritative click against the hardwood floor. I walked back out into the main living area. Harrison and the litigators were waiting by the elevator. Harrison raised an eyebrow in silent, profound approval as he took in my complete metamorphosis. I was no longer the exhausted woman wrapped in a damp hospital cardigan. I looked exactly like the corporate executioner he had hired me to be. I walked over to the dining table and picked up the 3 black leather binders. They were heavy, dense, with irrefutable evidence. The first binder contained the complete logs of the offshore wire transfers. The second binder held the forged power of attorney real estate transactions and the jeweler's receipt for the engagement ring. The third binder was a comprehensive, legally airtight summary of the embezzlement scheme, formatted for distribution to an executive board. I stacked them together, feeling the solid weight of Greg's impending doom resting comfortably in my arms. I walked down the hallway and opened the door to the luxury nursery. My daughter was awake, resting peacefully in the arms of the elite night nurse Harrison had provided. The nurse offered a warm smile, promising that the baby was safe and well fed. I pressed a gentle kiss to my daughter's warm forehead. I made a silent vow to her that the world she was going to grow up in would never again be dictated by the whims of a cowardly thief. I closed the nursery door and joined Harrison at the elevator. The descent down to the ground floor was silent, thick with a shared, predatory anticipation. We stepped out into the private underground parking garage, where an immaculate black limousine was idling, flanked by 2 dark security SUVs. The driver opened the heavy rear door. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, placing the stack of black binders on the seat directly beside me. Harrison sat across from me, and the 2 corporate litigators occupied the remaining seats. The limousine pulled out of the garage and merged seamlessly into the bustling city traffic. The ride to the venue felt agonizingly slow. The tension inside the cabin was palpable, a heavy electric current humming between us. I stared out the tinted window, watching the city lights blur past, mentally rehearsing every single piece of financial data, routing number, and forged signature. I was reviewing the ammunition, preparing to launch the targeted missiles directly at the fragile foundation of Greg's new life. The limousine turned onto a manicured avenue lined with towering oak trees. In the distance, the sprawling country club where the engagement gala was held came into view. The massive estate was brilliantly illuminated, glowing like a beacon of unearned privilege. A long line of luxury vehicles crawled toward the valet station. We bypassed the main line entirely, our security escort guiding the limousine directly to the VIP entrance at the front of the grand stone staircase. The vehicle came to a smooth halt. The driver stepped out, moving swiftly to open my door. I gathered the 3 black leather binders, clutching them securely against the charcoal fabric of my designer suit. The cool evening air rushed into the cabin. I stepped out of the limousine, my stiletto heels planting firmly onto the red carpet. I stood tall, flanked by Harrison Caldwell and a team of ruthless corporate lawyers entirely ready to crash the party of the decade. The club ballroom was a monument to extravagant wealth. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and caviar hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly from a raised platform in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the steady hum of corporate networking and high society gossip. At the very center of the room, standing on a slightly elevated dais, was Greg. He looked exactly as he had on the morning he locked me out of my home, polished, arrogant, and convinced of his own invincibility. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The sharp, clear ringing sound brought the room to a polite hush. Greg raised his glass high, turning his charismatic, practiced smile toward a distinguished, silver-haired man standing near the front of the crowd. It was Brittany's father, the chief executive officer of the very firm Greg was actively bleeding dry. Greg began his toast with practiced ease. He spoke eloquently about the future, about legacy, and about the profound honor of joining such a prestigious family and a visionary corporate empire. He bragged about the unprecedented financial growth he planned to bring to the company in the coming fiscal year. In the middle of the crowd, captivated by the performance, stood my parents. Thomas and Barbara were dressed in their finest country club attire, clutching their own champagne flutes like trophies. They were strategically positioned near influential board members, leveraging their proximity to Greg to elevate their social standing. I could practically hear my mother bragging to the elite guests, loudly referring to Greg as her incredibly successful son-in-law. They were beaming with pride. utterly enchanted by the illusion of wealth and status, completely blind to the fact that the man they were praising was a common thief. They traded their daughter for a front row seat to a magnificent lie. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom were currently shut, guarded by two men in dark suits. As Harrison approached, the guards recognized him instantly. They scrambled backward, pulling the massive doors open with frantic urgency. The grand entrance was completely unannounced, yet it commanded the immediate, breathless attention of the entire room. Harrison Caldwell stepped across the threshold, radiating a heavy gravitational pull that instantly shifted the atmosphere of the gala. The string quartet faltered, the cellist missing a note before the music sputtered to a complete awkward halt. The ambient hum of wealthy chatter died away, replaced by a tense, rippling whisper that spread rapidly through the crowd. The sea of elite guests parted instinctively, creating a wide, unobstructed path down the center of the ballroom. They recognized the man who held the keys to their corporate future. Harrison walked forward a few slow, commanding paces and stopped dead in his tracks. He did not look at Greg. He did not look at Brittany's father. He simply turned slightly and extended his right hand toward the massive open doorway behind him. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the vestibule and into the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. I did not rush. I walked with a slow, deliberate, and terrifying calm. The sharp, authoritative click of my stiletto heels echoed loudly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the ballroom. I moved to stand directly beside Harrison, clutching the three black leather binders securely against my charcoal suit. I kept my chin high, my posture rigidly straight, and my gaze locked entirely on the man standing on the elevated dais. Greg was mid-sentence, delivering a punchline to a corporate joke designed to charm his future father-in-law. The words died instantly in his throat. His charismatic smile froze, then rapidly contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His eyes widened, darting from Harrison Caldwell to the tailored designer suit I was wearing and finally settling on the cold, predatory expression on my face. His brain completely failed to process the visual data. The woman he had discarded on a freezing sidewalk with a single $100 bill was now standing in the center of his elite sanctuary, flanked by a team of ruthless corporate litigators. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of glittering, jagged pieces. The sharp crash of breaking glass punctuated the absolute silence of the room. The sudden sound of the shattering glass seemed to break the heavy spell cast over the massive crowd. Low murmurs erupted, laced with deep confusion and rising alarm. In the second row of the gathered guests, my parents were paralyzed. Thomas lowered his glass slowly, the color draining entirely from his face. Barbara stood absolutely frozen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes blinking rapidly as she struggled to comprehend the terrifying scene unfolding before her. This was not the exhausted, weeping woman she had handed a black garbage bag to. This was not the pathetic failure she had banished to a drafty basement. I did not look like a woman begging for scraps. I looked like a woman who owned the building. The profound cognitive dissonance was written clearly across their faces. They looked from me to the powerful billionaire standing protectively at my side, realizing in real time that their social calculations had been catastrophically wrong. They had placed all of their bets on a man whose glass was currently in pieces on the floor, while the daughter they threw away had somehow aligned herself with the most powerful entity in the room. Greg stepped down from the dais, his polished shoes crunching loudly over the broken crystal. His initial shock was rapidly giving way to a desperate, frantic aggression. His carefully constructed world was currently under threat, and his survival instincts were kicking in. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He demanded to know what I was doing there. He shouted that I was trespassing on private property, desperately trying to paint me as an unstable, jealous ex-wife attempting to ruin his special evening. He turned his frantic attention to the venue staff and raised his voice, demanding that security be called immediately. Two large men in dark uniforms began to move purposefully through the crowd, heading straight toward where I stood. Brittany clutched her father's arm, looking back and forth between me and Greg with mounting panic. Greg marched forward, closing the distance between the dais and the center of the room. He told the approaching security guards to grab me and drag me out of the building. He ordered them to physically remove me from the premises, screaming that I had absolutely no right to be there. The guards reached out to grab my arms. Before they could make contact, Harrison Caldwell took a single authoritative step forward. He raised his right hand, a simple, silent gesture that carried the weight of absolute command. The security guards stopped dead in their tracks, unwilling to cross a man of his immense stature. Harrison lowered his hand and looked Greg directly in the eyes, his voice echoing coldly across the silent ballroom. "You do not throw out the lead auditor of the firm that holds your company's future in her hands." The security guards lowered their hands and stepped aside. Harrison gestured for me to continue, and our group advanced toward the center table beneath the chandeliers. The path the guests had opened remained clear. Greg stood near the shattered champagne glass, breathing hard, his confidence collapsing into visible panic. I did not repeat the entrance he had already witnessed or answer his accusations. I simply walked past him with the 3 black binders held against my suit. Every step shifted the room's attention away from his engagement celebration and toward the evidence he was desperate to suppress. Before I reached the table, a distinguished silver-haired man separated himself from the crowd and moved to intercept us. I recognized Brittany's father immediately from the corporate dossiers. A distinguished man with silver hair stepped out from the crowd, moving to intercept us before we reached the center. I recognized him immediately from the corporate dossiers. It was Brittany's father, the chief executive officer of the firm Greg was currently bleeding dry. He forced a wide diplomatic smile onto his face, attempting to salvage the awkward disruption to his daughter's engagement. He extended a hand toward Harrison, warmly expressing his deep gratitude that the head of Caldwell Vanguard had made an appearance. But his smile faltered as his gaze shifted to me. He looked at my severe charcoal suit, the 3 heavy black binders in my arms, and the team of litigators standing at my back. He politely asked Harrison if I was part of his executive entourage, his tone laced with a subtle warning regarding uninvited guests. Harrison did not shake the man's extended hand. He stood with absolute terrifying stillness. He introduced me clearly, his voice projecting across the silent ballroom. He stated that I was not a guest. He announced that my name was Meredith, and I was the lead financial auditor and his direct legally authorized proxy for the impending acquisition merger. The CEO blinked, his hand dropping slowly to his side. The diplomatic warmth vanished from his features, instantly replaced by the sharp, guarded instinct of a leader sensing an immediate threat. He asked why the lead auditor of a venture capital firm was crashing a private family celebration on a Saturday night. I stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between us. I did not raise my voice, nor did I display a single ounce of anger or vindictive triumph. I maintained the exact clinical detached professionalism I used during routine corporate evaluations. I told him that the timing of my arrival was not a personal choice, but a fiduciary obligation. I explained that during the preliminary stages of the merger audit, I had uncovered financial anomalies of such catastrophic magnitude that they required immediate, undeniable intervention. I walked past the CEO and approached the massive circular table positioned in the center of the ballroom, originally meant to display the towering engagement cake. I set the 3 black leather binders onto the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy thud of the binders hitting the table echoed loudly in the cavernous room. Greg finally found his voice. He lunged forward, his panic overriding his common sense. He shouted at his future father-in-law not to listen to me, claiming I was just a bitter, unstable ex-wife trying to ruin his reputation out of sheer jealousy. He reached a trembling hand toward the binders, screaming that these were fabricated lies. One of the Caldwell litigators smoothly stepped into his path, blocking Greg's access to the table with a firm, immovable stance. The CEO looked at Greg's frantic, sweating face and then looked back at my absolute composure. He gestured for Greg to stand down, his voice dropping into a dangerous, commanding register. He turned to me and demanded to see exactly what I had brought to his daughter's engagement party. I opened the first binder. Several men in expensive suits, individuals I recognized from the financial reports as senior board members, began to gather around the table, drawn by the escalating tension. I systematically distributed the printed audit summaries to the CEO and the board members. I told them to look at page 4. I detailed the existence of the encrypted offshore routing loop. I pointed out the highly specific staggered cash withdrawals designed explicitly to bypass federal reporting thresholds. I did not hurl accusations. I simply let the numbers tell the devastating story. I watched the CEO run his finger down the columns of stolen funds. The blood drained from his face as he recognized the internal account numbers I had decrypted. I opened the second binder, sliding the relevant documents directly in front of the board members. I explained that the newly appointed chief financial officer had not just been siphoning corporate capital. I detailed how he was funneling the embezzled money through a private domestic trust created under a shell company. I handed the CEO the registration documents for that exact shell company, highlighting Greg's name as sole beneficiary. The board members began murmuring among themselves, the terrifying reality of the massive internal theft sinking into their minds. Greg was backing away, shaking his head, stammering that the documents were forged, that someone had hacked his accounts and set him up. I ignored his pathetic protests. I pulled out the fraudulent power of attorney agreement and the rapid cash sale deed for my suburban house, placing them on top of the corporate ledgers. I explained to the CEO that the man he was trusting with his corporate empire was the man who forged my signature while I was in a hospital maternity ward. I traced the timeline showing how Greg had used the stolen corporate funds from the offshore account to purchase the house out from under me, paying himself for the stolen property to fund the lavish lifestyle he was currently flaunting in their faces. I stated the man standing before them was not a financial prodigy. He was a cowardly, desperate thief who had stolen from his wife, abandoned his newborn child on a freezing sidewalk, and was currently bleeding their corporate legacy dry to finance his illusion of wealth. The ballroom was dead silent, save for the rustling of the paper as the board members reviewed the irrefutable evidence. Brittany had pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her face streaked with tears of confusion and mounting horror. She clutched her father's arm, begging him to tell her none of this was true. She looked at Greg, demanding he explain himself, but Greg could only stare at the floor, trapped in a cage of his own design. I turned my attention away from the devastated CEO and focused entirely on Brittany. She wore a stunning floor-length silk gown, looking like a princess whose fairy tale was violently unraveling. I kept my voice perfectly calm as I reached into the final binder. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, the digitized invoice from the exclusive jeweler. I slid it across the table toward her. I looked down at her trembling hands and pointed out that the 4-carat, flawless diamond engagement ring, currently sitting on her finger, had not been purchased with Greg's personal wealth. I calmly informed her that the magnificent symbol of their eternal love had been bought using the exact corporate funds her fiancé had stolen directly from her father's own company. The utter devastation settling across her features confirmed the surgical strike was absolutely fatal. The silence gripping the ballroom violently shattered. It exploded into absolute pandemonium. The undeniable gravity of the financial theft ripped through the gathered crowd of elite socialites and corporate stakeholders. A dangerous murmur escalated instantly into a cacophony of outraged voices. Brittany took a staggering step backward, her hands flying to her mouth as she looked from the digitized jeweler invoice lying on the table to the massive diamond sitting heavily on her left hand. The illusion of her fairy tale evaporated in real time. Her father, the chief executive officer who built his corporate empire through ruthless discipline, turned his attention completely away from the black binders and locked his eyes onto the man he had welcomed into his family. His face flushed a terrifying shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. He lunged across the space, separating him from his prospective son-in-law. He grabbed Greg by the lapels of his tuxedo, his voice booming over the panicked guests. He screamed at Greg, demanding to know how he dared to infiltrate his company, steal from his accounts, and use his daughter as a shield for corporate embezzlement. Greg attempted to pry the CEO's hands off his lapels, stammering out desperate apologies. He tried to claim the money was a temporary bridge loan he planned to repay in full. The pathetic, cowardly lies only fueled the older man's rage. He shoved Greg backward with tremendous force. Greg stumbled over his polished shoes, his arms flailing as he crashed into a cocktail table, sending platters of caviar and crystal glasses clattering to the floor. Brittany did not rush to help him up. She stood over the man she was supposed to marry, her chest heaving with deep, jagged breaths. The silk of her expensive engagement gown rustled loudly as she stepped through the spilled food and shattered glass. She looked down at Greg, her expression transitioning from profound heartbreak to pure disgust. She had spent the last year flaunting her perfect relationship, looking down on anyone she deemed beneath her social status, and mocking the woman Greg had discarded to be with her. Now she realized she was nothing more than a convenient pawn in a massive criminal enterprise. She grabbed her left wrist. With a sharp, aggressive yank, she pulled the heavy platinum band over her knuckle. She pulled her arm back and threw the 4-carat diamond ring directly at Greg's chest, with all the physical strength she could muster. The heavy ring struck him hard against the collarbone before bouncing off his tuxedo jacket and rolling away into the shadows beneath the buffet tables. She screamed at him that he was a repulsive fraud, her voice cracking with humiliated rage. She told him she never wanted to see his face again and demanded he get out of her father's venue immediately. While Greg scrambled on his hands and knees amid the broken glass and spilled champagne, my peripheral vision caught a frantic movement emerging from the crowd. Thomas and Barbara were pushing their way toward the center of the room. My parents watched the entire catastrophic execution from the second row. They had witnessed the evidence of Greg's crimes and watched the destruction of the man they had chosen to support over their own flesh and blood. However, instead of exhibiting shame or remorse for their horrific judgment, their faces displayed a sudden desperate opportunism. They looked at the elite corporate litigators standing respectfully behind my shoulders. They looked at Harrison Caldwell, the billionaire titan, treating me as his lead financial proxy. The social calculations in their minds were frantically recalibrating in real time. Greg was no longer the successful executive they could brag about. Greg was a ruined felon. On the other hand, was standing at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power, radiating undeniable influence. My mother rushed forward, a fake smile stretching across her face. She reached out, attempting to grasp my arm in a theatrical display of maternal pride. She announced loudly, ensuring her voice carried over the murmurs of the crowd, that she was my mother. She told the surrounding executives that I was her brilliant, successful daughter, claiming they always knew I would achieve magnificent things. My father stepped up right beside her, nodding vigorously, puffing out his chest, as if he orchestrated my triumphant return himself. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I looked down at my mother's outstretched hand, letting an agonizing silence hang in the air until she awkwardly pulled it away. I kept my posture rigid, my charcoal suit acting as a solid wall against their toxic, opportunistic affection. I raised my voice, pitching it to carry clearly across the entire ballroom. I ensured that every board member, socialite, and corporate investor heard my response with absolute clarity. I stated loudly that they were mistaken. I looked into my mother's eyes and told her that I had no parents. I announced to the room that the people standing before me had handed a bleeding, exhausted mother a black garbage bag and kicked her and their own newborn granddaughter out into the freezing rain to protect the very criminal currently cowering on the floor. I stated that I had no family ties, no inherited wealth, and no lingering obligations to anyone in this room. I proclaimed that I only had a beautiful child waiting for me in a safe home and a powerful career I had built with my own hands. I told Thomas and Barbara that they had made their choice weeks earlier when they demanded rent for a concrete basement floor, and they would have to live with the permanent consequences of that choice. The public rejection was absolute, severing the final threads of my past with a clean cut. My parents shrank back, their faces burning with inescapable social humiliation as the elite crowd stared at them in disgust. Greg realized he was completely trapped. He had lost his corporate position, his wealthy fiancée, his stolen assets, and his dignity. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the caviar smeared across his trousers. He pushed past a bewildered waiter knocking over a tray of drinks and sprinted toward the heavy oak doors leading out to the grand foyer. He was desperate to escape the humiliation of the ballroom, hoping to disappear before his crimes caught up with him. He reached the brass handles of the exit, throwing his entire body weight against the heavy wood to push the doors open. He burst out of the ballroom and into the brightly lit corridor. He did not make it a single step further. The massive doors swung wide to reveal two tall men wearing dark tactical windbreakers, with federal insignias printed across the chest panels. They were federal agents, and they were standing side by side, completely blocking the exit. One agent reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of folded paperwork. He stepped forward, grabbing Greg forcefully by the shoulder and spinning him around to face the ballroom. The agent announced in a commanding voice that he was holding multiple active signed federal warrants for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Harrison Caldwell stepped up beside me, a dark, satisfied smile playing across his lips. He casually noted that his legal team preferred to call the authorities 30 minutes prior to a confrontation, ensuring the cleanup process was as efficient as possible. Federal agents moved with swift, practiced efficiency. They recited Greg his rights, locked cold steel handcuffs around his wrists, and escorted him out of the grand ballroom through the service exit. The transition from a celebrated corporate executive to a disgraced federal inmate took less than 5 minutes. Over the next several weeks, the absolute devastation of Greg's carefully curated life played out exactly as Harrison had predicted. Brittany and her powerful father immediately severed all ties with the man who had nearly brought down their corporate empire. They issued aggressive public statements, disavowing him entirely, cooperating fully with the federal authorities to ensure the embezzlement charges stuck. Stripped of his wealthy fiancée and the corporate backing he thought made him invincible, Greg was left completely isolated. His accounts were frozen by the federal government pending the fraud investigation. He could not afford a private attorney. The man who had mocked my lack of legal resources on our freezing front porch was now relying on an overworked, underpaid public defender to save him from decades in a federal penitentiary. I watched this complete dismantling of his reality, not from the cold basement of my parents' house, but from the secure, expansive office of Caldwell Vanguard, preparing for the final phase of my legal retribution. The family court proceedings were remarkably brief, devoid of the drawn-out, agonizing battles Greg had threatened me with at the diner. I sat at the polished wooden table next to the elite family law attorney Harrison had provided. Greg was escorted into the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a heavy metal chain wrapped securely around his waist. He looked gaunt, pale, and entirely devoid of the smug arrogance he wore so comfortably during our marriage. He avoided making eye contact with me, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. The judge reviewed the staggering mountain of evidence we presented. The documentation of the forged power of attorney, the illegal sale of our marital home, and the massive offshore embezzlement scheme painted an undeniable portrait of a severely compromised, dangerous individual. I did not have to argue or beg for the safety of my daughter. The judge ruled swiftly and decisively. I was granted full sole legal and physical custody of my child. Greg was stripped of all parental rights, his visitation privileges permanently revoked due to the risk he posed and his impending federal incarceration. The financial judgment was equally catastrophic for him. Armed with the complete audit of his hidden domestic trusts, my legal team successfully petitioned the court to reclaim every single dollar he had stolen from our joint savings and checking accounts. We presented the precise timeline of his deceptive transfers, proving undeniable malicious intent. But we did not stop there. We secured a judgment for the full equity of the house he had fraudulently sold, plus aggressive punitive interest, covering the extreme emotional distress and physical endangerment he caused by locking a postpartum mother out in the winter rain. Every hidden asset, every luxury vehicle, and every remaining cent in his private accounts was seized to satisfy the staggering debt. He was left completely destitute, stripped of his unearned wealth, and legally bound to a massive financial deficit he could never hope to repay from inside a prison cell. I sat quietly as the heavy wooden gavel fell, feeling the suffocating weight of the past month finally lift from my shoulders. The legal system had firmly and formally recognized his profound crimes, permanently protecting our future, and my daughter was forever safe from his incredibly toxic influence. 2 days later, I drove to the federal holding facility, where Greg was being held without bail pending his federal plea hearing. I did not go for closure, and I certainly did not go to offer forgiveness. I went to deliver a final tangible reminder of exactly who had engineered his massive catastrophic downfall. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the sterile visitation room separated from my former husband by a thick pane of bulletproof glass. Greg sat down heavily on the opposite side. He picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. I picked up my own, holding it to my ear. His voice trembled thick with desperation and manufactured remorse. He begged me for leniency. He pleaded with me to speak to the federal prosecutors to tell them he was a good father who simply made a terrible mistake under intense corporate pressure. He cried, promising that if I helped reduce his severe sentence, he would spend the rest of his natural life making it up to me and our daughter. He swore he had lost everything and had absolutely nothing left to his name in the entire world. I listened to his pathetic whining pleas without a single trace of emotion showing on my face. I looked directly at the man who had looked at my shivering, exhausted body and decided my intense suffering was a perfectly acceptable price for his unearned luxury. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not offer a grand dramatic speech about betrayal, vengeance, or justice. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal blazer. I slowly pulled out a single, crisp piece of printed currency. It was the exact same $100 bill he had so casually tossed onto the wet, freezing concrete of my front porch. I deliberately flattened it out, sliding it smoothly through the narrow metal transaction slot at the very bottom of the thick glass divider. I told him he could use it to buy himself something warm at the prison commissary to help him survive the long winter. I carefully placed the heavy telephone receiver back onto the metal hook, permanently cutting off his desperate, echoing, sobbing voice. I stood up straight, turned my back on the thick, bulletproof glass, and walked out of the cold, sterile concrete room, leaving him to stare blankly down at the money, while the heavy steel doors locked firmly and permanently behind me. The consequences did not end when Greg disappeared behind federal walls. His arrest detonated through the social world. My parents valued more than their own family. Photographs from the gala circulated across business pages and club message boards. Guests repeated how Barbara claimed me as her successful daughter seconds after Greg's fraud was exposed. Within days, dinner invitations stopped. Thomas was quietly removed from 2 club committees. Former friends began avoiding Barbara in the dining room. Their financial problems worsened. The speculative stock position collapsed completely, and the lender placed a lien against their house. Thomas blamed Greg, the brokerage, and me. None of it restored the money. Barbara contacted me through new numbers after I blocked the old ones. Her messages shifted from rage to apologies, then warnings about abandoning aging parents. I saved every voicemail, but answered none. Several months later, Greg entered a federal plea after prosecutors presented the offshore records forged power of attorney and diner check. The agreement guaranteed years in prison and restitution from recoverable assets. The judge later approved the agreement, resolving the gap between his detention, formal sentencing, and eventual transfer into the federal prison system for years without contradiction. For the first time, his future was governed by numbers he could not manipulate. One cold morning, the reception desk at Caldwell Vanguard called my office. Thomas and Barbara were in the lobby. They had arrived without an appointment, carrying a box photo album and sign reading "Family deserves forgiveness." Their crying attracted employees entering the building. I considered refusing. Then I remembered the garbage bag striking my leg in the rain. I asked security to bring them to a lobby conference room. I would not allow them into the penthouse, my office, or any space linked to my daughter. They looked smaller than they had at the gala. Thomas's expensive coat was worn at the cuffs. Barbara's hair was carefully styled, but her eyes kept drifting toward the ceiling cameras. She immediately opened the photo album and pushed childhood pictures across the table. There I was at 6, missing a front tooth. At 12, holding a school trophy. At 22, standing between them at graduation. Barbara said those photographs proved we had once been a loving family. I told her photographs proved only that we had once occupied the same frame. Thomas placed the cardboard box on the table. Inside were toys for my daughter and a folder of unpaid bills. Their house was approaching foreclosure. Their club membership had been suspended. Friends stopped returning calls. He said they understood now that Greg had deceived everyone and asked me to help them start over. I asked whether they regretted what they did or merely regretted the consequences. Barbara began crying harder. She said fear had clouded her judgment and insisted she had only wanted me to preserve my marriage. I reminded her that she had ordered a postpartum woman to beg a criminal to accept her as a mistress. Thomas said the words sounded terrible when repeated that way. I told him they sounded terrible because they were terrible. Then their true purpose surfaced. Thomas requested enough money to stop the foreclosure and restore their retirement accounts. Barbara added that a public reconciliation would repair their reputation. She suggested photographs of me embracing them could be released through Caldwell Vanguard's communications team. Even their apology was a transaction to improve their social position. I closed the photo album and pushed the financial folder back across the table. I told them forgiveness did not require renewed access. I could release anger without reopening the door. They had made a deliberate choice when they placed my newborn in a freezing basement, charged me rent celebrated with the man who robbed me, and handed me a garbage bag. That choice had consequences no apology or emergency could erase. Barbara reached for my hand. I withdrew it before she could touch me. I told them I would not pay their debts, rescue their house, restore their membership, or stage a reunion. My daughter would not be introduced to people who treated love as a reward for status. The family they had discarded no longer existed for their convenience. Thomas's face hardened. He accused me of enjoying their suffering. I answered that I did not enjoy it, but I would not prevent it. There was a difference between revenge and refusing to absorb consequences that belonged to someone else. I stood and signaled security. Barbara shouted my name as officers entered. Thomas demanded one final chance. I opened the conference room door and told them the chance had been the night I arrived carrying their granddaughter through the cold. They had already used it. Security escorted them through the revolving doors and onto the sidewalk. I watched from behind the glass until they disappeared into the morning crowd. Then I returned upstairs and never saw them again. 1 year after the gala, Harrison gathered senior leadership in the boardroom. He announced that my audits had protected Caldwell Vanguard from fraudulent acquisitions and recovered millions. He placed a partnership agreement in front of me. This time the signature created something no one could steal. I became a full partner. That evening I drove home to an estate purchased in my name. It was not excessive, but it was secure, warm, and surrounded by trees. My daughter, healthy laughing, waited with her nurse near the balcony doors. I lifted her into my arms and stepped outside as the city lights appeared in the distance. I thought about the house Greg sold, the ring I pawned, the basement, and the black limousine. Those memories no longer controlled my life. The greatest revenge had not been Greg's arrest or my parents' humiliation. It was standing in a home built from my own decisions, holding a child who would never be taught to confuse cruelty with love. I had not inherited an empire. I had built one they could never enter. The greatest lesson I learned from losing everything is that hitting rock bottom is sometimes the exact catalyst needed to discover your true foundation. We are taught to believe that our family will be our ultimate safety net. However, as my journey and so many others have proven, sometimes the family we are born into completely fails us, and we must realize that the family we find along the way can be stronger than blood. When you are stripped of your resources and abandoned by those who favor status over loyalty, you are forced to rely on your own resilience. I learned that true power does not come from screaming, crying, or begging for a seat at a table where you are not respected. You truly do not need your family's approval to build a meaningful life. True power is recognizing that your value isn't determined by others' flawed assessments of you, and that lasting validation ultimately comes from within, not from their approval. Protecting that peace requires enforcing ironclad boundaries, which is never an act of cruelty, but rather a necessary act of self-preservation. Ultimately, the sweetest justice against those who betray you is not always found in their public ruin or financial collapse. Sometimes the absolute best revenge isn't destruction, but simply becoming so successful, so happy, and so free that their opinions no longer matter. It is about systematically building an untouchable, beautiful empire of your own and realizing you never actually needed them to succeed. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you have ever been underestimated, betrayed, or forced to walk away from toxic individuals to build your own independent life, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience. Share your own experiences of finding strength and enforcing boundaries in the comments below. Remember, your inherent worth is never determined by those who are too blind to see it. Stay strong and keep building your empire.